Hello, and welcome to Sobercast, where we provide AA speaker meetings and workshops in podcast format. We're an ad-free podcast, and if you enjoy listening, please help us be self-supporting by visiting Sobercast.com, look for the donate link, and drop $1 or $2 into our virtual basket. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Have a great day.
My name is Eric, and I'm an alcoholic. No pressure after that introduction. I have no idea who she was talking about. My sobriety date is June 9th of 1990, so 25 years and some change. And some days it seems like last week, and some days it seems like 50 years ago. But most of the time it's just, most of the time I try to approach it as gratitude, because I am really grateful. And it's great to be here with you this weekend. I've been to the Netherlands Convention, I think 5 times, 3 times here at Elspeth in this beautiful, beautiful place, and a couple times at a couple of Dutch cities, the names of which I could not remember or pronounce. And I've always loved this convention, and Dina's always loved this convention, and it's really a blessing to be here, and thank you to Holly and the committee, and to all of you for your recovery and your fellowship and your warmth this weekend. We've had a great time. My drunkalog is pretty simple. I drank a lot. I fell over a lot. I woke up on other people's bathroom floors a lot. I woke up in my own living room floor a lot. I sometimes woke up in my bed a lot. But it was fairly undramatic. I never went to jail. I never woke up on another continent after a blackout. I had tons of blackouts. I had blackouts almost every time I got drunk, but I usually woke up someplace I recognized, or there'd be someone nearby I recognized. So it was all fairly undramatic and really fairly pathetic. And when I got into Alcoholics Anonymous, I had a job. It wasn't a great job. I didn't love it, but it was okay. I'm an alcoholic. I haven't loved most jobs. So, but I had a job. It was okay. I had a safe place to live. It was a friend's basement, but it was safe, and it was comfortable. I had a car that ran. It had valid license plates on it. And I even had a girlfriend. So, outwardly things were fine. Problem was that inwardly I was dying. And I knew it, sort of, in that way that we have right before the end, that we know something awful is about to happen any second now. We're just not quite sure what it is or how to stop it. And I got a late start, really, on alcoholism, except for an incident in my toddlerhood that's not terribly important. I didn't really start drinking until shortly after high school. I grew up in a teetotaling home, a home without alcohol. My parents were fairly religious and didn't believe in drinking, and they didn't drink, and none of their friends drank, and it was all sort of morally looked down upon. And in high school I had a bit of that attitude, not for religious reasons, because I had long since decided religion was terribly uninteresting. But I had kind of a moral attitude about drinking, and people would say, like, there's going to be a cake party this weekend. I'd be like, yawn, and little did I know. But that summer I went on a beach trip with a bunch of my friends, and a combination of fake IDs and bars that didn't care. We managed to get a hold of, all of us underage drinkers managed to get a hold of enough that I had a chance to drink more than the few sips I had had every now and then, and to feel an effect. And I was like, oh, this is what they meant. I get it now. Because for me, what happened, and if you're here tonight because you're an alcoholic, I assume that you had an experience that at least was somewhat similar. For me, it was all the noise in my head, which had been screaming at me for nearly 18 years at that point, stopped. And I had not known until that moment that the screaming was there. But somewhere around, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, 10th drink, it was gone. And I was like, oh my God. And I was like, wow, And my best friend at the time, whom I'd known since we were both about 12, I think, at some point that week, which is all very blurry, but at some point that week he said, you should be careful with this because you're having a different experience than we are. 17-year-old kid said this. I hate overachievers. And I looked at him and I basically declared myself an alcoholic. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I said, don't worry about me, I can control it. Fast forward 12 or 13 years and I learned that that's the sort of thing that non-alcoholics don't say very often. And I didn't even really mean that I could control it because I had no interest in controlling it. What I was saying inside was I was pledging to myself that I was going to do this as often, as soon, and for as long as I possibly could. Because that feeling was so unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And that's what I did. And I didn't drink for oh dear, something's falling. It's not mine, so it's apparently okay. But I drank for about 11 years. And honestly, I didn't, there wasn't really that much trouble. It was, I went to university a few weeks later. I went to a non-party school, but ended up living for my first year in the only party dorm on campus. That wasn't intentional. They sent me a map, said what dorm you want to live in. I was like, well, that one looks okay. Picked it, it's on the quad, that's pretty, so I'll take that one. Turns out that was the party dorm. We have a knack sometimes. And, we had keg parties every weekend and sometimes on Wednesday nights to warm up for the weekend and frequently on Monday nights to get over the weekend. And it was fabulous. And the thing is that at first, drinking as much as I could, as often as I could, worked in such a way that in a lot of areas of my life, I got much better. I was a better student going to class still half drunk than I was in high school just being, listening to the screaming in my head and being fiercely angry at everyone and everything. And I, my social life improved. I still did not have the enormous herd of women that I thought I deserved coming at me, but, it got better. And it was a huge amount of fun. And I suppose if it had stayed that way, you'd be having a different speaker tonight. And I don't know when it changed. I know that it changed before I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, obviously. But somewhere in there, that enlargement of the universe that happened. When I drank, it was like the universe really did seem infinite. And more importantly, I was at the center of it. And that changed. It was like the universe got smaller and smaller and smaller. And by the time I walked into Alcoholics Anonymous, it didn't seem to be big enough for me anymore. And instead of making me feel better and enlarging the universe and putting me at the center of it, and shutting off the noise, it just made the noise louder. And I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know why this was happening. I knew about Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, I knew of Alcoholics Anonymous. I lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was at that time pretty much the epicenter of the treatment center industry in North America. And there was a treatment center on every corner. And I used to joke that, the 12 steps are on the city buses and, which wasn't true, but it felt like it. So, I knew of AA. And I had 3 years before I got sober, I was an actor, and I worked at the Shakespeare Company. And for one thing, I had resolved not to drink much that summer, so I took a pledge to myself I was going to drink 1 beer a night for 10 weeks, and I did. And oh God, was I a miserable colleague. Can you imagine? One beer a night? I'd rather chew sand. But I got through it. But there was an actor working with us who was in AA. Didn't care at all about his anonymity within the company. Was bold-faced about it. He was about 6 months sober, I think, less than a year anyway. And he wasn't having a good time. His early sobriety was not easy. And he would come into rehearsals at whatever time in the morning it was, 9 or 10 o'clock, and he'd be bouncing off walls and chain smoking and, calling us all every name he knew and just being a complete basket case. And at noon, when rehearsal was called for lunch break, he'd run out the door and disappear for 2 hours. And he'd come back utterly transformed. Just this completely different human being. Funny, relaxed, peaceful, grateful, sterling colleague. That he was a really tremendous actor, and we'd sort of see that come out instead, and we'd be like, we like this guy so much better than the one in the morning. And he was going to AA meetings. And backstage, he'd always have some AA literature, and he'd, right before curtain, he'd sort of, tell us something about the 12 steps and all this stuff. And I don't know how everybody else said. I kind of pat him on the head and, not live well, probably sometimes literally, and think, well, it's really great that exists for him. And I, I don't know where he is today, or I'm not sure I could come up with his name accurately, but that made an impression. Because 3 years later, when I wanted to die, I remembered AA. And I remembered that this really fragile guy that I had once known had gone to AA. And you had taken care of him. So I knew it was safe. I didn't really think you could help me. But I knew it was safe to come here. And then I started dating this woman who told me on our first date that she didn't drink. So I mean, you know what that means? Well, best not drink in front of her. So I didn't, because that always works. And I don't know, a few weeks later, somewhere along the way, somebody broke anonymity to me, but then when we started thinking about getting more serious, she said, you need to know something. I'm an alcoholic. I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous for the last, I don't remember what it was, a couple of years, I think. She said, and you need to know that if we're going to be in a relationship, because my sobriety is the most important thing to me. And if I let anything get in the way, I'll drink and I'll die. And you need to know that if we're going to be together. And I was like, wow. I think maybe sometimes I think about my drinking and I wonder, and she just said, that's none of my business. I'm just telling you about me. She had a really good sponsor. And so I thought if this was going to work, and what the heck, drinking wasn't working for me, so I'd give it a try. And I knew there was something about one day at a time, so I thought I'll try not to drink one day at a time. But I better call AA just in case, so I got the phone book out. This is back in the phone book days. For those of you who are younger, it was a book. It had names and phone numbers in it. You'd have to dial the phone. By candlelight. But so I looked up in the phone book, and Minneapolis, St. Paul is a fairly large metropolitan area, larger than the country I now live in. There were a bunch of numbers listed under Alcoholics Anonymous. I called the one that was closest to my house, which was not the central office. It was a clubhouse that only had meetings in the evenings. Their answering machine was broken, so no one answered. I called several times a day for a few days, but I made a pledge I wasn't going to drink until I talked to you. And then you didn't answer the damn phone. So I went a week not drinking, not intending to do this, but just because, I'd made this bargain. And finally I got someone on the phone. I called right as the meeting was breaking up, and I said, I need a meeting schedule, and they told me about the meetings at that place, and they said, well, we're going out to coffee now if you want to join us. And I was like, oh, God, no. And hung up. And then for another week, I drove by, I went and found it. It was a couple kilometers from where I was living. And I drove by every day, and it was up above a retail shop, a lamp store, I think. And there was this unmarked brown door. And I was like, that's where the alcoholics are. Behind that door. If I need them, I'm sure I won't. But if I do, that's where they are. And so I went another week without drinking by just driving by 2 or 3 times a day. That's where they are. And then I woke up on a Saturday morning, and I knew I was either going to drink or I was going to go to that meeting. And I knew what would happen if I drank. And for the first time in a very long time, I decided to take a chance on doing something from which I didn't know the outcome. And I went to the meeting instead. And at first it was awful. I mean, it was a big room. It was about half the size of this room. It was everything I was afraid it would be. It was a dingy room with a bunch of old people smoking. And they were kind of over in that corner. I was 28 years old. The next youngest person had to be mid-40s. And there was a clump of them. They were smoking. They were laughing, which I found truly offensive. And I walked in and saw them and went over there. And the whole time my head was screaming, "You got to get out of here! You don't belong here. They're going to make you leave. You can't stay." And I looked up on the wall, and they had one of these. Is that the right one? Yes, traditions. And I saw. I'd never heard of the traditions, but I saw the phrase, "The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking," and I knew I could stay because you had a sign in the room that said I had a right to be there. I didn't belong. I was pretty sure I wasn't an alcoholic. I was pretty sure you were going to tell me that. I was pretty sure you were going to want me to leave. But it didn't matter because you had a sign on the wall that said I could stay. And that kept me there long enough for them to, pick the person with the least time, some poor woman, 30 days, who I thought was the president because she had 30 days. And she came over and introduced herself and said, "Do you want a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Yes." And she went and got me half a cup. I mean, I didn't even like coffee, but, she could have at least brought me a whole cup. I learned later that was because, they brought half cups to newcomers in case we had the shakes. It was an act of love. I didn't know that. I spent my whole life not recognizing acts of love, even when I first got to Alcoholics Anonymous. And by the end of that meeting, I was an alcoholic. They didn't tell me I was one. They didn't do a first step meeting. They talked about the 12th step. I had no idea. I was like, there are 12. No, there are 12 of them. And I was like, read it and went, yeah, that's not very interesting. But in the course of these old people, all of whom had terrible hair, but in the course of all this, I heard enough of a message to know that I was an alcoholic, that you were alcoholics, because you drank like I did. You felt the same way when you drank. You did the same things I did, sometimes in much more dramatic detail, often in much more dramatic fashion, but that despite the age difference and so forth, that we were alike, and that you had found an answer. And if I was like you, then that answer might work for me. And so I left with a bunch of phone numbers and a big book. And I told my girlfriend the next day, and she said, "That's wonderful. My home group's on Tuesday night, and you're welcome." And so I went to her home group on Tuesday night, and it was huge. It was like 60, 100 people, something like that. And it was not a bunch of old people smoking. It was a lot. There were some old people there. But there were a lot of people my age. There were teenagers who had 3, 4, 5, 6 years of sobriety. I was like, what, you got sober at 10? I mean, wow. And it seemed like everybody in the room was smiling. It was like being in some sort of, really happy Shark Tank. All these teeth coming at me. And it seemed like everybody there knew my name, or at least knew a lot about me. I thought that either my girlfriend had been telling them about me, or, they were just psychic. And of course they just, they knew a newcomer. They knew what we are, what we do, how we think. And they made me feel very welcome. And that became my home group. And I was very fortunate because it was a group that believed in triangles that have 3 sides. And they said, AA, the triangle has recovery, unity, and service. And we have to have all 3 if we're going to stay together in fellowship and if we're going to stay sober as individuals. And they had the reputation of being a group. They called them tradition cops behind their backs. And they were pretty intense. I used to joke, and it was sort of true, that they would lovingly tackle the newcomer and gently beat him with the big book. And there was some truth in that. The message I heard every week was clear and focused and straight out of the big book. That, if this is your problem, this is how we understand it, if this is how you understand it, this is what we've done, and it's yours if you want it. And I desperately wanted it. Those are the most attractive people I have ever seen. We hear a lot about attraction in AA, and it's not what we're wearing. It's although it pains me to say this, it's not what our hair looks like. It's who we are and what we're bringing, and the lives that we're living as recovered alcoholics. That's what's attractive. And, the homeliest person in the room in the shabbiest clothes can be the most attractive person if he or she is working a program of recovery, because that's a person that radiates hope and it radiates positive energy. And this to me seemed like a meeting where everyone was doing that. And I think probably the first meeting they sort of expected me to help put up chairs and take out the rubbish and do those things. And they said that's because it's service and it helps us stay sober and it helps other people. And I started doing that. And they explained to me that one of the reasons we did sober is that we did service was it helped us not think about ourselves. Now, I still like thinking about myself, but it is true. Service sort of helps me think about someone else. And I learned that in that group, and not just because they told me, they told me, they showed me, and they taught me. And I wasn't always a willing learner, but, eventually some of it soaked in. I got a sponsor, in part because they said I should, and in part because sponsors in that group, when somebody had an anniversary or birthdays, as we in Minnesota they call them birthdays. So when people had an AA birthday, their sponsor would get up in front of the meeting and say nice things about them. Well, that seemed cool. I mean, so I got a sponsor because I was coming up on 30 days, and I wanted someone to get up and say nice things about me. And then on the night, I tried to talk him out of it. I was like, no, I really don't know, because then I was terrified. And he said, this isn't about you anymore. We don't celebrate AA birthdays for our own celebration. We celebrate it to show the person who's sitting in the room with one day that 30 days is possible. So it's not about you anymore. And I still remember that, and I still occasionally, not so often, but occasionally I've had an anniversary. I was like, this hasn't been a great year. I don't really want to talk about it. But I remember my first sponsor saying, this isn't about you anymore. And I increasingly learned that AA in general was not about me anymore. Or ever. That was a bit disappointing. But, and my first year of sobriety was great. It was the textbook pink cloud. I wasn't probably literally skipping down the street, but I felt like I was much of the time. And I just thought this was the greatest thing ever created, and you were all so wonderful. And I just loved it. And that meeting was a Step and Tradition meeting, and I went every week, and I went to other meetings as well, but I went every week, and I sat and I talked at great length about the steps. Hadn't done any of them, but I talked at great length about them. I talked about the traditions. Was starting to understand a few of them, but not with any real, based on any real experience. And a year later, things changed. The job I'd had that was okay didn't exist anymore. The girlfriend disappeared. I mean, we broke up, and she moved away, and I wanted to drink again. I hadn't wanted to drink that entire first year. I don't know because the desire had been removed or just because I was so giddy that I didn't notice it or whatever. But suddenly it came back and it came roaring back. And the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go to an AA meeting or hang around with you happy people. And the members of that group didn't let me out of their sight. I mean, I don't say that literally. But, in the afternoons I'd get a phone call saying, you going to the meeting tonight? I was like, well, I wasn't. Yeah, I guess. Can I have a ride? Yeah, fine. And I know what they were doing because I've been in many groups that have done that since, for mostly for other people, but and I hope I've been a part of doing that for people. They saw fellow alcoholics suffering, and they picked me up and held me until I could sort of get past it. And my sponsor in the meantime had disappeared, so I got a new sponsor, and he was very, he was very cut and dried. He just sort of very straightforward, and he said, I don't know what you want in a sponsor, but this is what I know how to do. I can take you through the book, I can help you work the steps, and if that's of interest to you, then I can help you. If that's not what you're looking for, then you'll need to find somebody else. And I said, that'd be great. And so we went through the steps. And at no point did a burning bush appear at the foot of my bed, or the clouds open up and a choir of angels sing to him or anything, and I'm still quite disappointed about that. Because I thought Spiritual Awakening was going to be dramatic. I wanted a Cecil B. DeMille film. And what I got instead was, as I got through the steps, and somewhere in the middle of step 9, and none of my amends were terribly dramatic, because it was mostly just petty, stupid stuff I'd done. I mean, I hadn't, like, toppled a foreign nation or anything. And so it was all fairly, it was all embarrassing and humiliating, but it was nothing really that dramatic. And somewhere around there, I realized that I didn't want to drink. And I realized that at some point in the previous months, that desire had gone, and this time it really felt gone. And that was, almost about 24 years ago, and that has not returned. I haven't wanted to drink in all of that time, and that has nothing to do with me. That is the power of what the steps can do in our lives, because the last 24 years have not all been pink clouds. Some of them have been, or pretty close to it. Some of them haven't. Life does not stop because we get sober. And life is not always fun. I think that's terribly unfair, but it's true. In the last 5 years, both my parents have died. My mother had Alzheimer's, and anyone who knows anything about that knows it's hideous and it takes forever and it's just wretched. But as a sober son, I got to be with her. I was with her when she died. My sister and I both were. We got to walk through that relief, because it was, and that grief. And my sister and I are much closer. We've never been particularly close. She's several years older than I am. But we've become much closer because of that. A couple of years before my mom dying, my father died somewhat suddenly. And I had a difficult relationship with my dad. I don't think I'm being unfair when I say he was a difficult man. He was a very angry man. He was never abusive. He was never drunk. And I know now that he loved us the best he could. And on most score sheets, that was pretty good. He provided for us. He protected us. He took care of us. He was not warm and fuzzy. And I was a kid who sort of went through life demanding warm and fuzzy and got mad when I didn't get it. So we didn't always get along. And even when he died, I felt like I had, on balance, often been a real disappointment to him. But I got to be with him the day he died. I wasn't with him at the moment, but that day. And that's a huge gift. Losing family, losing friends is something we're all going to go through. If you haven't yet, you will, because it's part of life. And because of Alcoholics Anonymous, I got to be there at the end for both of my parents. And that's a huge gift, and I thank you for it, because on my own, I wouldn't have been anywhere near, sick bed, hospital, So that was fairly huge. I have had a chance, as Holly mentioned when she was talking about whoever that was, I have had a chance I've had the opportunity to do a lot of service in Alcoholics Anonymous, and both on the important level, or the most important level. And the most important service we perform in Alcoholics Anonymous is when we talk to another alcoholic, period. That's my opinion, but I feel it quite strongly. But we have books, and we have literature, and we have pamphlets, and we have videos, and we have public information committees, and we have alcoholics in, I think, something like 150 countries in the world, and the big book translated into something like 80 languages in the world and stuff, because people get involved in general service. And I've had the opportunity to do some of that, and it's been at times maddening, but most of the time it's been a huge gift. It's an opportunity. I heard someone in the States many, many years ago say, we have general service so that we can separate ourselves from the world and pick on each other. And sometimes that feels like the truth. But what it's really there for is so that my group in Luxembourg, where it can feel fairly isolated at times, can get literature to help alcoholics coming through the door. If we have an issue that as a group we haven't faced, we can send a GSR to an intergroup meeting And that GSR can speak on our behalf to other GSRs and help us find a way forward. Representatives from that intergroup can go to a region meeting 4 times a year and talk to representatives from other intergroups and find common solutions to the difficulties and the issues that we all face as intergroups and as groups. And once a year, we can send delegates to a conference in York and take up matters that concern the fellowship as a whole. And I've had a chance to be in that room a few times, and it's pretty amazing. There are several people in this room who had that same experience, and they may not have all thought it was amazing. But for me, it was a profoundly moving thing to get to see the democracy and the spirit of the fellowship working together towards a common goal on such a wide scale, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for it. Yes, getting close. I'm already over time. It's Alcoholics Anonymous has been and is the most important thing in my life. And everything I have in my life today that is of any value to me whatsoever, and I'm not talking about material stuff, although I like my toys, but everything that's of any value, I owe directly to Alcoholics Anonymous because I wouldn't have any of it. I am close to sort of my only surviving family member today. We weren't close for 50 years. I mean, we didn't hate each other or anything. We just weren't very close. And we're fairly close now. I got to be there for my parents. I met my wife at a service meeting in Brussels in Alcoholics Anonymous. The Ostend meeting that Holly mentioned was sort of the weekend we realized that we felt something for each other. And 2 years later we got married. And we had my oldest friend in sobriety came over from New York to read the St. Francis prayer at our wedding in the UK. And my sister, I spent the longest period of my life in Minnesota, but I was originally from the South, and my sister never left. So she has this very heavy Southern accent. And she and my wife's cousin, who's from Birmingham, England, and has a very heavy Brummie accent, read alternating stanzas of a poem at our wedding together. And it was such a great blessing. I cried all the way through our wedding. My wife has been crying ever since. I'm normally the weepy one. I've gotten to go to some of the international conventions, the first one in Minneapolis, because they held it 10 blocks from my flat. And I was like, well, if you're going to throw a party in my neighborhood, I guess I'll go. And then my wife and I went to San Antonio. We just got back from Atlanta, and that was, again, just an incredible experience to sit in a stadium with 50 or 60 or however many tens of thousands of people are there, most of whom are alcoholics, and those who aren't have undoubtedly seen their lives changed and improved by virtue of being around Alcoholics Anonymous. Is an incredible thing. And again, that's just a pure gift. I hope that I live today in gratitude. I don't always. I know that. There are times often when I'm in traffic, when I feel particularly ungrateful for the car in front of me, behind me, beside me, someone. But most of the time, I try to live in gratitude. My first sponsor was big on an attitude of gratitude, as he called it, and he taught me. He wasn't my sponsor for terribly long, but there are a few things he taught me that really stuck with me, and one of them was that gratitude is an action. I can sit around all day long and say thank you from now till sunrise, and that's irrelevant. What am I doing to show that I mean it? And at Alcoholics Anonymous, you've shown me how. I don't do it perfectly. Many days I don't do it very well because I am not by nature a grateful person. But you have shown me how, and little by little, I live that better today than I did, certainly when I got here, and probably even than I did a few years ago. It is progress, not perfection, and an inch at a time is still an inch at a time. Or 2.54 centimeters at a time is 2.54 centimeters at a time. So I'm really, it's thrilling to be here tonight. I'm so grateful to you all, to this program, for the last 25 years. for the however many millions of us there are around the world. In San Antonio 5 years ago, the International, I bumped into a guy who was at my very first meeting. He was walking through this enormous hall, 60,000 people milling around. It's like, you were at my first meeting. And he was like, dude, you know. And we talked about the meeting. He hadn't been to that same meeting in years, but he remembered it. He said, yeah, I remember. Oh, yeah, wow, that was so cool. How you been? Haven't seen him since. Probably never see him again. But, you know, those sorts of things. I've heard the word coincidence a lot this weekend, and I get the sense that many of you don't really believe in coincidences. My own spirituality is kind of weak. I'm terrible at prayer, and I tend to fall asleep during meditation. But I wouldn't begin to try to define my higher power, except that I look around this room and I know I've got one. And he, she, it, or them seems to, you know, help out. And I don't care what yours is, you know, God, Yahweh, Elvis, whatever. You know, there's clearly something here that can help us. But in my spirituality, I do sort of believe in coincidences. But there was a German poet and playwright who wrote, and this is a bad translation, but wrote more or less, he said that God gives us coincidence. It's up to us to do something with it. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, slowly but surely, you seem to be teaching me what to do with those coincidences. You seem to be teaching me how to do that with gratitude. And you sure as hell seem to be keeping me sober. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Sobercast is ad-free, and we'd like your help in order to keep it that way. So if you'd like to help us be self-supporting by pledging $1 or $2 a month, visit Sobercast.com and look for the donate links. Thank you very much.